I thought we could look at a big topic that's not really addressed too much in music anymore, and it's the folk tradition, the folk music tradition in the context of culture. And by the way, you might hear some extraneous noises from my hallway today. They're doing some renovations in an apartment across the hall, but you know, it's related to this topic because that's life. People are around us at all times. We live in a culture, and there's pros and cons, two sides of the coin to everything really, but specifically about this type of folk culture. So if we go back to, I don't know, 50, 60 years ago even now, but certainly 100 years ago and past then, you had what I would call the geographically based culture, musical culture. So most people grew up in a town or a village or countryside, an area, a geographic area, a location. And the culture that they experienced, stories, songs, dances, dialect, words, phrases, sense of humor, worldview, was influenced by the people who had lived there earlier, and some of whom were still alive and around them. So a little baby's born. They have parents, grandparents, older siblings, the school teacher, if they went to school, the shopkeeper, whoever was around them were singing songs. This is 100 years ago. Certainly was before TV, the internet, MP3s. And it was also before recordings, really. I mean, there was a couple of recordings in 1918. That's when jazz was first recorded, by the way. So, so you got it in a very vibrant way, right? I'm not saying life was better back then. It was probably more dangerous just to walk around in a lot of ways. A lot of crime. But basically, there was a folk music and culture that was being passed down. Interesting. And I've done a lot of research from time to time, but I'll get into it once in a while. Just very briefly, Grimm's fairy tales were a good example because the brothers Grimm, Jacob, and I forget the other one, basically were very interested in these folk tales that were not children's tales. They were told in taverns. That was their entertainment before movies. You would hear these stories, and some of them were had sort of a spiritual bent. Some were funny. Some were warning you not to go into the woods at night because that was not a safe place to be, right? Things like that. Little Red Riding Hood, Hansel and Gretel. And but what the Brothers Grimm saw were a couple things. They saw, number one, that these stories were not being told as much anymore because people were learning how to read, more people. So they were buying books. Also, books were getting less expensive, so they could buy them. So they saw these stories in danger of being disappearing. And then what they did was they primarily went to a few older people who knew a lot of those stories, dozens, if not hundreds of those stories. And they had them tell them to them. And they wrote them down and they published them. And some of them were definitely not for kids, And so they preserved them, but they also wanted to make some money by selling these books because more people were buying books. And then throughout, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, their collection of stories went through 7 editions. And the ones you get today are basically the 7th edition. It's very hard to find a complete version of the first edition. I don't have one. Maybe it's published now, but a few years ago it wasn't. And what they did was they gradually changed these traditional fairy tales, or not fairy tales, folk tales, the stories into stories that were suitable for children. Because they saw that's where the market was. People wanted to tell these stories to their children, so they called them like kinder tales, folk tales, children's stories, and they cut out some of the more violent parts because it wasn't suitable for young kids, and they also gave them morals, like Aesop's fables have morals at the end. So they changed them. In order to preserve them and keep people interested in them, they felt they had to change them, for good or bad, right? But we know these stories because of the two brothers Grimm today. They would have been lost, probably, a lot of them. So it's a two-edged sword. But that's an example of the folk tradition I'm talking about coming through. Now, in music, it just occurred to me when I was about to start this video, never thought of this before, we're in one of the first generations where the people writing pop music and listening to pop music, teenagers and people in their 20s, have very little connection with folk music. And again, some really great music being written, but a lot of it is kind of a little more empty, or certainly not rooted in these sort of vibrant dances and things. The Beatles had this, right? Yellow Submarine, We Can Work It Out, things like that. Very folk music influenced. Bob Dylan, certainly folk music influenced. Ed Sheeran, example of somebody who'll write a little sea shanty type song and violin influenced, with a lilt to it, something like that. Billy Joel's Piano Man, one of the most popular classic rock. It's not really a rock song. It's a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. And Billy Joel was smart in the production. He plays harmonica, which was like Bob Dylan at the time, early 70s, but he also put in an accordion, which is like an old-fashioned, at that time, 1930s, 40s, 50s, waltz kind of thing. We're at a big party. If you like Journey, right? Jonathan Cain, the keyboard player of Journey, said in an interview once that he loved playing polkas as a kid and going to these big polka fests where everybody was, the clarinets and the accordions and everything. And everybody's having such a great time. And he wanted to recreate that in the 70s and in the rock era for a huge, massive stadium. So they wrote these sing-along type songs, like Don't Stop Believin', to recreate that feeling he got when he was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old at these polka fests where everybody was having such a good time. That was a smaller what I was talking about, geographic culture coming through. But that was behind a lot of Journey's music. Really interesting when you think of it like that. And it's sort of beneath the surface. Now, for me, it's really interesting. I was born in 1964. So this is right before the sort of social transformation. The Beatles, that really hit its peak in 1967, the Summer of Love in America. Then the hippies, all that. So I was born right before that. And a lot of the old stuff was thrown out by the mass culture at that time. Although they did sing a lot of folk music and play a lot of folk music on guitar at that time. But people were moving around more. And so I go back to my parents, who were born in the 40s. Now, my dad was Hungarian and Polish. My last name, Drodos, is Hungarian. And my mother's side, it's German, English, and one grandfather was from northern Italy. Way back when. One of my great-grandparents was from northern Italy. So anyway, rice instead of pasta up in northern Italy. But the thing is, not much was passed along. My father wasn't allowed to learn Hungarian, to speak Hungarian, because, you want to make living in America in the 1950s, you speak English. That's what his father told him, and he regrets not learning Hungarian to this day. But I did go to one sort of polka-based wedding on the Polish side of the family. It must have been around 1969, when I was about 5. We drove out to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I remember my dad's cousin got married, and it was like a scene from the movie The Deer Hunter, where that took place in Pennsylvania as well, where there, it's like that thing I was talking about, Jonathan Cain. So much fun. I don't think I've ever had more fun at a wedding since than that wedding. It was just so lively and vibrant, and the music reflected the culture that had been passed down. So that's the background to what we can do now. That's disappeared pretty much. I live in New York City. I live in the Bronx, right above Manhattan now. And, I moved here, and not any of my relatives live here. And the culture, there's all these different cultures. It's wonderful. So we live in sort of a postmodern age, culturally in terms of this folk culture. So what I did when my kids were born, this is now 15 years ago, my oldest son was born, I bought a book of folk songs, which I don't have anymore because our apartment got flooded once and it was on the floor and we had to move out for a while, and that book got destroyed. It was like folk songs from around the world. I definitely recommend getting books as much as possible rather than just printed sheets, although you can put these in a 3-ring binder. If you have a book sitting on the piano, you tend to open it much more, and you tend to browse. That's one thing we don't do as much on the internet in terms of music, is, you bought a book because you like 10 songs in it. It's cheaper than buying the sheet music for those 10 songs, and then you have 100 songs that you can just browse through and you learn more things like that. Definitely, whenever possible, get a book. So I had a book of folk songs around the world, and I created a cultural tradition for my kids. Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle went to town, dun, 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 pony. I'm not good with lyrics, but I learned 6 verses. Father and I went down to camp along with Captain Goodin. There we saw the men and boys as thick as hasty pudding. Yankee Doodle. I learned 6 verses out of about 20. The idea behind these folk songs is that they have a vibrancy that you can bring to yourself, or if you have young kids around, before they get sort of jaded and not interested, because we consider folk music kids stuff, but it really isn't. In our culture, we consider it that. So think about it, this liveliness, dun, 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 dun. I would imitate a snare drum. I'm not thinking, is it perfect voice leading or anything? Sure, I've played long enough, I can play good voice leading. But I didn't right there, I just move up parallel. Because I actually like that on the keyboard. Yankee Doodle, keep it up. It's instilling ourselves with those feelings that have been passed down. We're experiencing something of the original culture it came from, sort of from the inside. We're feeling the life that they felt. When you dance like this, or even play it on piano and feel it like a dance, you're experiencing something that somebody felt even hundreds of years ago, if not more. That was very alive, and whoever created that song had that feeling, and it's been passed down. And we should embrace that, because it can help all of our playing. So what I used to do is I used to just make up my own arrangements, and I would encourage you to do this for yourself, but also if you also have little kids around. Like for instance, I used to do another American folk song called "I've Been Working on the Railroad," and I'm not a great singer, but I would sing it. I think it helped my piano playing too to get into this. So it's let's see, it was in the key of F. So I'll just go, I've been working on the railroad, oh, I live one day. Just staccato. Da, 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 da. The number one reason that we don't sing usually is that we don't think we're good enough, right? We don't go out dancing because we don't think we're good enough, right? But if you have a newborn baby, they don't know if you're good enough. They don't even care, because it's not important. What's important is that communication. Much, much more important. And by doing it, you'll get a little better. I'm not a great singer now, but I was even worse before I started doing that. And I don't care. I've even sung publicly if I was playing at church and the soloist was sick or something. I got the mic and I did it. There you go. I think you can hear the hallway. They're taping down some protective padding on the floor. So we'll just keep going though. So what I would do is do those things. Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow? Just have fun. Da 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 da. I was thinking of a horn. Dinah, won't you blow? Bum bum. Dinah, won't you blow? Bum bum. Dinah, won't you blow your horn? And I remember when my older son John, when he could crawl, so he was about 8 months old or something. If he was in another room, playing, doing something, and I wanted him to come into the room with the piano, all I had to do was, and he would come in with a big smile on his face, and he still loves music to this day. I don't push that necessarily, but he's learning a little guitar, likes to sing, and I think a lot of it's a real gift we can give ourselves and our kids. Even in classical music, people are learning Chopin waltzes. It's kind of a made-up minute waltz there. But they're not dancing waltzes. So they're not playing the waltz like a waltz, really. They haven't experienced that, whereas Horowitz or Rubinstein or people of that generation, they grew up. They went to a wedding as adults. Famous pianist, Arthur Rubinstein. When he went to a wedding in the 50s, people were dancing waltzes. So or 60s or even 70s. So he played the Chopin waltz in a way that was not only more authentic, you don't always have to play things authentic, but he did it in a way that had the vibrancy, the life of the waltz from experience. Whether he was a good waltzer or not, that doesn't matter. I love playing tunes like Shenandoah. You could just play simple chords in the left hand. So you're just outlining the chords. Sixth there. And you know what? You get so good at it just by doing it a lot. I did print a few things just to show you. So I did Carnival of Venice, because what I was saying is I sort of put together, this wasn't in my original collection for my kids, but since we don't have things passed down to us, like our 30, 40 folk songs anymore from our own tradition, we can find a book of them, world music, folk songs, or on the internet, and we can put together a collection that we like, and that we want ourselves to experience, or our kids are grown up with. So Carnival of Venice is a good example of like a lively kind of waltz thing. It'll help your piano technique so much just to be able to sit down and play these songs. A lot of them just have the 1, 4, and 5 chords. And this is a guitar part here, and mandolin. But if you know that most of them are 1, 4, and 5 chords, you could write it in. You could say, oh, that's an A chord here, it's the 1 chord in this key, here's the 5 chord, E7, another E7, and then an A. And then you're not dependent on those voicings, which are more for a guitar anyway. You could just go... play the simplest or the most complex. What is it? Even Elton John knows folk songs. Sometimes in an interview, he'll just start with Barbara Walters. He just started playing Skater's Waltz, sort of a waltz, right? He knows these kind of styles, and it comes out in his playing. Just for fun, I did something from a culture that's very different than mine, Chinese folk song. And this is Mountains So Green, Streams So Blue. I don't know it, but it's interesting because it has different chords than Western music would. And I know that in China, or at least I think, it usually would have been played just single melody without Western chords originally, but they've adapted them. So added chords. Love that. That makes me feel, it gives me a feeling, and that's the point. It gives us a feeling that we wouldn't have gotten from playing our usual music. So it starts out with a nice minor chord, and then this beautiful melody that skips around. That was a surprise. I thought it would go or something. Goes lower, da da da, then higher. And then there's no chord on the next line, so I could just maybe play in unison. And then knows the second page I didn't print. But just to give you an idea how you can play these with lead sheets, or if there's an accompaniment. A lot of times, I think the book I had, and I forget, it was like Library of Folk Songs or something. It had piano arrangements and then the chords. So I might look at the arrangement to see basically what it was, and then make up my own kind of based on that, or I would just throw it out like I've been working on the railroad and just do my thing. I used to put some blues in too, like. That's a Dr. John lick. Look at my blues, classic blues course for that, stuff like that. So, Dinah, won't you blow? Anything you're interested, you could put into these folk songs. So if you're interested in bass lines that move, Dinah, won't you blow? Dinah, won't you blow? You could do that. If you're interested in stride. Interested in like guitar style, finger style. Maybe not on this song so much, it needs more vigor, but on other songs, the Shenandoah. Doing on that song is in between the verses, I would just do a 1, 6, 4, 5. Then I go into the second verse. So you could bring your improv, the flowing water. Just immerse yourself in this. So this is kind of an overview video in the at least how in my estimation the importance of this disappearing folk culture that's geographically based and passed on to us because of the region we live in. That's disappearing. But with the internet and collections of books and everything, the whole world is available to us. And yes, it's overwhelming when we look at the whole world. Okay, there's 1,000 folk tunes in England, 1,000 in Scotland, 1,000 in China, 1,000 in Africa, all the drumming, and then French, and then South American, and Russian. And, I travel to Alaska every summer to teach, and I've gotten to know some of the native cultures up there, friends of mine, and also the songs that are being passed along. And it can be overwhelming, so you don't need to do all that. You can just pick 20 that you like. Either check them off in a book or photocopy them and put them in a binder. Don't just leave them around. And immerse yourself. And particularly if you have young kids, it's really great for them. And then you can do other things just to finish up here, like we've been talking about, like the improv I just did, or even just varying the melodies. So if you had Shenandoah, it's one of my favorites. Keith Jarrett recorded it on a great album called The Melody Alone at Night with You, solo piano. You could vary the melody. That sort of like a bagpipe, they kind of do those fast things. Or a flute. Just went up and down the scale. So, again, folk songs, collect your own collection, make it doable. Pick ones that, well, almost all of them have simple chords, so you can just start learning them. They're a great way to, it's sort of the background, the undercurrent of even a lot of the music we're studying. Mozart and Beethoven. Beethoven wrote arrangements of Scottish folk tunes. Did it for the money, but he still did it, and he loved those tunes. You know, he loved folk songs. He brought some of them into his string quartets, or in my opinion, sort of wrote a lot of pieces that sounded like folk songs and hymns. The Allegretto in his Second Symphony, Seventh Symphony. Let's see. That sounds like the music he might have heard sung in church, you know. But he wrote his own, or he wrote fast Russian-sounding folk songs, or maybe even used them in some of his string quartets. I'm not sure. But anyway, everybody from Ed Sheeran today, Taylor Swift, country music. It's really influenced by folk music. You know, it's still there a little bit, but not in our culture anymore. Bring it to yourself, bring it to your family, particularly the young kids, and you'll find that it brings a life to everything you do musically. Have fun with this, and if you want to send me any recordings of yourself playing things or just ask me questions, feel free anytime. Thanks.